Welcome back to Data Driven Recruiting. Today we will talk about early technical talent hiring by the numbers.
Awesome. So to do the research, we looked at LinkedIn data. Of course, LinkedIn is a great resource for looking at like who is working at what company, what school they went to. One caveat is that not everybody has a LinkedIn account. A lot of people do, but not everybody does, especially around like new or early grads or like grad students. So some of these numbers would be underestimates, but they still provide a very interesting lay of the land of like where do people go to school, where do they graduate from, what do they do after graduation.
Yeah, sounds good. So we looked at all the 2018 graduates in the US with a bachelor's degree in computer science or computer engineering.
Yep.
And there were about 70,000 of them. Yeah.
Which is crazy because only 4 to 5 years ago it was almost half of that. So it's growing at a rate of like 25 to 30%, I think, year over year. In my opinion, it should be growing even faster. I think if there was, more deliberate career advice around like what majors to choose. I mean, computer science, computer engineering is like a booming field, and there's so much demand for talent in that space.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to only accelerate from here on.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to note here is that the growth is driven by more of an industry pool and the needs for that specific talent, not by just we producing more, bachelor's degree graduates overall. That's true, but also I think that now computer science, or in the last 10 years, computer science has become one of the biggest major, most popular major in a lot of the higher education institutions, passing the economics and finance and accounting, those areas.
Absolutely. I think it should be overpassing it even more, but we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. So let's look at the breakdown of these 70,000 new grads. About 60% of them are in the tech industry, and about 5% of them are in finance, like investment banking or credit card or like diversified financial institutions, and then the rest of them are kind of split across various industries.
Yeah.
So
I was expecting honestly that finance would have a bigger chunk of all of this new sort of graduate talent going into tech, mainly because there's just so much talk about like the need for more security, more privacy, and like better security guardrails, right? So like finance industry is becoming more and more high tech. So for some reason, when we were looking into this, I was expecting that even more people are getting pulled into finance. But I guess it's relatively a new idea of like finance going high tech.
Yeah, and I think the fact that the FinTech is actually considered tech industry in this regards, because they're not regulated in the same way as the financial institutions that we are calling here. And I think there is another part. I think we've seen a huge number of growth in number of technology companies compared to number of financial institutions. Right, because getting an approval to become a new bank is like a very difficult thing, and it's a highly regulated. So I think that each individual financial institutions in our list actually, as you saw, hired a lot of new grads from this field. But I think just the total pure number of institutions who are in these categories is smaller.
Yeah. Actually, let's talk about that. So when you look at the list of the top 25 or so, right, like who hires the most new grads in this category, I think to your point, it shows that like some of those like large banks and financial institutions do actually hire almost as much as like some of the big tech companies, right?
Right.
So the top of the list is still like the big tech companies, the tech giants, right? The Facebook, the Apple, Google of this space. They hire close to 1,000 out of this, 60 to 70,000, which is it's a pretty big percentage given how selective all of them are.
Very high concentration of employment.
Very high concentration on that one. But I think when it comes to the tech companies like Capital One, like Goldman Sachs, they still hire a very, very sizable like a new grad population.
Yeah.
Probably not as much as like Google, Facebook, and Amazon hire, but I think it's still, according at least to LinkedIn, it's around 300 to 500 each, bringing in like a class every year.
Yeah, that's substantial.
Yeah. And then there is another interesting category in the top 25, which is more of the, like the defense contracting, like companies who've been around for a very long time, such as Lockheed Martin, such as Raytheon, even the U.S. Air Force hires pretty actively new like computer science and computer engineering graduates, which is good to know because they're going high tech as well.
Right, and then I think more and more the war is not only, battles are not just taking place in physical space, it's a virtual just cyber. So
cyber security all the way.
Right, it's important to have the cutting edge technology on that side as well. Yeah.
And I guess probably the more surprising and unexpected one is like the consulting companies, right? Like Deloitte.
Yeah, Deloitte or Accenture. I think there is also, because the technology company or the needs for technical services is in high needs. Yep. I think the consulting companies with the large technical technology services or IT services as their vertical, I think are showing up because they also need a lot of highly educated and proficient ones to be able to serve their clients. Yeah.
I'm not surprised to see Walmart in the top 25 list because they're trying to keep up with Amazon, so that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
But I think like Deloitte and Accenture, you're totally right. I think they're the more tech continues growing and the more tech clients they get, the more the need to have like more technically prepared consultants.
Yeah, and I think what we also see is that you could be a software engineer for a tech company or a financial company as a full-time engineer building like in-house things, but it could be also more flexible. You're hired as a full-time employee at a consulting company, working on different projects at different companies.
Right.
So I think it's a interesting one. Because I think another thing, what we haven't considered here, because we only looked at the full-time employment status, is the part-time or contractor role. And I think in IT and tech, there is a huge market for that as well. So.
Right. And then there's, of course, missing like everybody who's like switching careers, everybody who's like, hasn't gone through traditional schooling. So I'm sure like they hire a lot more than the numbers that we were able to find by just focusing on computer science and computer engineering.
Yeah.
But again, it does give like the relative proportions of hiring. Yeah, so one interesting stat is that like Google, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon combined hire about 10%, a little bit over 10% of all the computer science and computer engineering graduates, which is interesting because if you ask those companies, sometimes they believe that they hire only the top 2%, but like if combined they hire 10%, somebody's not hiring the top 2%.
Right, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess also if you are a technical recruiter at a company outside of these top large companies, then I think that's another thing to really think about, like the competition you have and maybe the needs for thinking outside the box to really identify highly talented people without necessarily going into head-to-head with these large companies.
I think pretty soon we should, just to like wrap up today's episode, I think we should look at where are these hires coming from. I think like you can dig in and find out like, let's say at Facebook, Apple, and other companies, right? Like, is there a specific concentration of schools? Because this only shows like how many they hire, but it doesn't really show the distribution of where they hire from.
Right.
I have a theory that like a lot of this hiring that we're looking at from these well-known companies happens from a very small group of schools, which is very unfortunate. So I'm looking forward to looking at that data.
Yeah. The same here. Okay, so could you wrap up today's episode with the bottom line?
The bottom line, I guess, is that it's the tech industry and just overall like people concentrating in computer science and computer engineering is growing fast, but not as fast as it should be. And I think there is an insane competition from many different angles, right? So it's easy to think that it's like, oh, if I go on major in computer science and computer engineering, I'm going to be working in tech. It's not true, right? Only 60% of the time you end up going there. And I think the trend is only going to continue. Like more and more industries, as they get disrupted by technology, you're going to see that skill being applicable all across the board.
Yeah.
So I think more and more it's going to be a lot like literacy and a lot less like a specialized education.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your insight today, and we'll see you next time.